Welcome to the Peaceful Political Revolution in America podcast. Events in America, like the 2021 United States Capitol Insurrection, are not unique to America. Brazil also suffered from a similar crisis on January 8, 2023. The attack there on all three branches of government in Brasilia was largely the result of the former president's insistence the election had been rigged. His supporters believed him, and although he lost by almost 2 million votes, the crowds turned out to overturn the election in much the same way Trump supporters did on January 6, 2021. I thought we should have a look at what's going on in Brazil and take a deeper dive into Brazil's constitution for a sense of what is driving the rise of populism in Brazil. The United States and Brazil enjoy broad political and economic relations. Brazil is the second most populous democracy in the Western Hemisphere and the world's 12th largest economy. The United States is Brazil's second largest trading partner, second only to China. It may surprise some of you to find out both the United States and Brazil are considered flawed democracies, but there are differences. Whereas the promise of democracy in America is considered to be our birthright, Brazil has had to overcome a monarchy as well as a dictatorship established by a military coup which was supported by the United States and then President John F. Kennedy. That dictatorship lasted 21 years until February 1st, 1987, when a popular constituent assembly composed of elected representatives of the several political parties in Brazil drafted a new democratic constitution, which was then formally ratified in 1988. Juliano Benvindo is professor of constitutional law and head of the Center for Comparative Constitutional Studies at the University of Brasilia. He is also a fellow at the Brazilian National Council for Scientific and Technological Development and Capes Humboldt Senior Fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law in Heidelberg, Germany. His books include On the Limits of Constitutional Adjudication, The Rule of Law in Brazil, The Legal Construction of Inequality, and Constitutional Change and Transformation in Latin America, co-authored by Richard Albert and Carlos Bernal. Juliano, welcome to the Peaceful Political Revolution in America podcast. It's great to have you here.
Great to be here, Joe.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Brazil and the United States are the two most populous democracies in the Western Hemisphere. There's Canada. Mexico's not a full democracy. We have a lot in common with Brazil, including what recently took place on January 8th in 2023.
Yeah, John, great to be here. We can say that January 8th was, it's not that it was a January 6th in Brazil, but there's a lot to compare here. I think we passed through similar movements. You had Trump in the US, we had Bolsonaro here in Brazil. And what is striking is that both, when they left office, the immediate outcome was people invading Congress. In Brazil, also the presidential palace and the Supreme Court. So, the three branches of government. Of course, the geography helps because it's the same plaza there. So you have this, so people go just cross the street and they are in the other palace. But of course, this is something really bad of our democracies, I can say. At first, we had would-be autocrats in a way in the West and Brazil, and using the same tactics, the same, I can say, almost the same methodology. of communication and of governing in a way. Of course, the agenda was not the same, but the way they govern was quite similar in many respects. The way they communicate with society. The difference, I can say, comparing the U.S. and Brazil now, especially that almost 2 years in the U.S., the difference is that in the U.S., the consequence that we've been seeing in the U.S. is a higher polarization in politics. And this implies a more difficult government maybe for Biden in a way. And also here we might have that too. But one particular feature of Bolsonarismo, we call it Bolsonarism, you can say, is that there is a strong connection of the military. So this is something that might be different. We have, I think Bolsonarism is a consequence both of militarization of politics and politicization of the military. And also, I can say of, these new far-right movements and strategic movements using, the internet and all the social media very strategically and very, they have a real plan. They know how to do it, how to communicate. And this is bad. So, but on the other hand, we can say that both the US and Brazil are one of the few countries that really could kind of muddle through this process. We had this would be autocrats in power, and they didn't get reelected. So this is quite, for Brazil, it's very impressive because Brazil is much younger as a democracy.
Yeah, it is impressive. And it's, it's just a lot of conversation these days about the attack on democracy globally. We have a relatively new constitution in Hungary, but Viktor Orban is, doing a number there. Venezuela, other countries in Latin America which are struggling with democracy. The United States is struggling with it. And so it becomes a really important thing to understand how it can be resisted around the world, not just in Brazil, but also in America. In your recent article on constitutionnet.org titled Brazil's Frenetic Pace of Constitutional Change under Bolsonaro, that really caught my attention. Our constitution is almost impossible to change, and many scholars here say it's a serious defect in the American system, which has become a real problem for the United States. I totally agree with that. What makes the Brazilian constitution so easy to change, and why does it concern you?
It's not well, we change a lot the constitution, and I can say that I'm not totally sure whether it's the first in the world, but it's certainly one of the first in the world nowadays. The rate of constitutional change yearly. So if you look at the numbers, it's just like 3.5 or 3.7 amendments per year. So it's a lot.
It's a lot.
Yeah, in comparison to the US, it's certainly a lot.
I'm a little envious.
But what makes Brazil? The question is sometimes people, especially in the law schools, there are some constitutional lawyers who says that that's a problem for Brazil because we change too much the constitution. And one of the things that we usually think of constitutions is that they must be a bit rigid, not like you can be flexible, that you can change that much. Mm-hmm. But there are some reasons for that. The first one, I think, is that, our constitution design in comparison to the American one is much more flexible. It's all the deliberation takes place in Congress. You don't need to go to the states and, all this kind of very complicated process where each state must pass discuss and whatever. So everything takes place in Congress and the two houses. So you have this in the Senate and also in the House. So it's not that complicated. And it's also 3/5. So it's 60% of the congressmen in the two houses. That's not much. It's less than the average in the world. Usually it's 2/3. So Brazil's a bit less than that. And what I mean by constitution design compared to other countries, Brazil is quite easy. It's not that complicated to pass an amendment. It's just like if you have a matter which is more, demanding, you need more support. So you need a constitutional change, but it's not that you need just like a revolution or something like it. Not a revolution, but something really, that you need to spend a lot of energy for that. It's just like you need a bit more of support in Congress. So that's how it is. But one reason why we change also is that sometimes people say we have a very detail-oriented constitution. We have like 65,000 words. So if you compare to the American one, which is maybe 7,000 or something like that.
But I think it's 4,000, yeah.
Yeah, so it's more than 10 times or 11 times, I don't know. So it's just so for example, if you want to change something related to tax, so you go to the Constitution. If you want to maybe change something related to, I don't know, the pension system, you need to go to the Constitution. So in the end, it's just like we need to make these changes in the Constitution rather than like a normal legislation.
You also write that the mechanisms for good governance and institutional stability have been severely undermined under Bolsonaro, right? So that's a consequence of this easiness to amend the Constitution. Is that correct?
Yeah, in a way, yes. He was less successful than we thought in destroying our Constitution, the text itself. So we had some constitutional change, but in the end, okay. I have to be more correct here. If in his government, for example, in 2021, I guess, we had maybe 7 constitutional amendments. So if you look at the average of 3.5, in just 1 year, we had 7. So it's more than the average. It's a lot. And many of these constitutional changes were related to maybe to increase the possibility of public spending. And there was some like subverting the electoral process in a way. So, for example, we have a golden rule, which you cannot increase the public spending in the year previous or actually in the year of the elections. And he did that. So for example, there is this rule there, but it's a constitutional rule. So what can you do? You cannot pass a normal or an ordinary legislation because it's going to be unconstitutional. So what he did, okay, let's pass a constitutional amendment. So we are in the same level.
Right.
If the Constitution says you cannot do that, but I can pass a constitutional amendment saying I can. So the thing is whether this constitution amendment can be unconstitutional. This is another discussion which is also very interesting because this is also, in my opinion, this is the kind of unconstitutional constitutional amendment. But until the Supreme Court says it's unconstitutional, it takes a while. So this is how he managed to subvert the system in a way. So there was some constitutional amendments that he tried to subvert the constitutional system in this kind of, strategic changes, which, you could not do that through ordinary legislation. So let's do a constitutional change. And he had the support of the Speaker of the House. He kind of managed to pass this in Congress. And there is always discussion, okay, we need to increase public spending because we had the pandemic. So we need to spend more because there are a lot of people just are now much poorer than before. So there was, and even the left-wing parties who actually, it was very difficult for them to say, no, we cannot spend more. So, so in the end, he passed all this constitutional amendment. He had even the support of the left-wing parties.
You've written a lot about inequality. I think that's a really interesting part of the conversation. For me, it seems like in the United States, we still have quite a bit of inequality, and its disparity between the rich and the poor has never been greater in this country as it is now. At the same time, we're seeing our democratic institutions being challenged, right? You've touched upon something here in your book the rule of law in Brazil, you get into the challenges facing Brazil as a consequence of inequality. And you write, the rule of law is not a simple concept when it comes to defining the political, economic, and legal developments of a country like Brazil. Similar to many other Latin American countries, Brazil is a young democracy struggling with its long-standing extractive industries and entrenched interests. It features, however, one of Latin America's richest constitutional moments, when civil society actively participated in drafting the most democratic constitution in the country's history. I mean, this is what my podcast is really all about, right? Because I would like to see that happen in the United States. I don't feel like our Constitution is really very democratic. There is certainly a long history of extractive institutions and entrenched interests in the United States as well. These are things that we have to come to grips with, and we're not doing a great job at that. I have to applaud Brazil for making the effort. It's a successful effort to get rid of its autocratic government, the dictatorship, in 1988, right?
Yeah, the Constitution was written in 1988. Our transition to democracy took place in 1985. Of course, there are some nuances here in these dates. But when you see Brazil, the struggle with inequality is something that is actually our history. We could never really overcome this reality. We are a very unequal country, one of the most unequal countries in the world. If you go across Latin America, this is a fact. Brazil is one of the most unequal in Latin America, and in the U.S. is also very unequal. We had both slavery. This, of course, is also a point. But the thing is, the rule of law, this concept which is very used in constitutional law and political science, and it's a kind of a standard concept. Sometimes it's difficult to translate. For example, in Brazil, we don't use rule of law. We use Estado de Direito, which is a more concept more connected to civil law. Even in civil law, there are many nuances when you compare one concept to the other. But the idea here is that, my perspective is that rule of law doesn't work well in a very unequal country, because we have some coordination dilemmas that are just get more complex. When you have an unequal country, it's much more complicated to, I say that the Constitution is a coordination device. So it kind of helps coordinate some behaviors of our institutions and individuals, and in a way it helps. It's kind of a focal point. This is not my argument. This is a very well-known discussion of constitutionalism. But the idea is that if you have a very unequal society, you have a problem of coordination. So institutions don't work that well. Individuals don't behave as expected. And in the end, we have a very, dysfunctional rule of law. So if the country is very unequal, it will affect how institutions behave and how you see democracy in the end.
That's a very interesting point. You're saying that if the society is divided, unequal, not everybody is participating in the process of making decisions together. Is that basically right, what you're saying?
It is. Of course, so when you have a more participatory constitutionalism, people really participate in, legal matters, and they are involved in decision making, and I don't know. This is important, and when a country has some, when its design, I can say its constitution design has some mechanisms to include these people and participate, this matters. So, and I think this is empirical. Many discussions we have in constitutional law mention inclusion as a really important point for the resilience of constitutionalism and to keep the rule of law more functional. So, yes.
You mentioned the problem of malapportionment. In the United States, we have, the Senate, which Michael Claremont has called one of the worst malapportioned legislatures in the world. How does malapportionment manifest itself in the Brazilian system?
The Senate, yes, like in the US, because you have these states where you just have, if you compare São Paulo to Acre in the north, it's just like, São Paulo has, so it's the difference is quite, 4 times more, something like that. It's just like, it's just, but the Senate we have also this in the House. So we have the biggest states like São Paulo can elect 70 deputies, we call.
Okay.
And the smallest states, 8. So, it's much less. But if you compare the number of people living the small state and the big, São Paulo is much bigger.
Right.
So this is the malapportionment. And the discussion is whether it's something that is bad for the system because, of course, people don't see much representation when they see this difference in a way. On the other hand, there are some scholars, and one of them is Marta Hetch, is one of the greatest experts on federalism in Brazil. And she says that this malapportionment, in a way, is like a mechanism to diminish the inequality, the regional inequality we have. So usually, São Paulo is very wealthy in comparison to other states in Brazil. So it's good that we have like a state where poverty is much more pronounced. So this is a way of, make a bit more equal the system, the political system. And it's a very interesting discussion. And others say this is totally, there's no sense at all. It's totally weird. We have to actually follow how many people live in there. And that's how it should be because this is representation, correctly speaking.
Equality and representation, right? Those are the two fundamental things that I associate with a truly democratic nation, that on some level there is this genuine equality amongst the population. Maybe they all have access to healthcare, they all have a basic sense of security and well-being, that they are also able to have their interests protected by the government to some degree. I guess having really good representation is the way that happens. The Constitution is the tool that we use to, create the political system which is going to provide that kind of representation to people. Is the political system in Brazil adequate when it comes to defending the rights and equality of people in Brazil? How do you feel? Because, like you say, it is one of the most unequal countries in the world, and yet it's a democratic country.
Yeah, that's this is it looks like a paradox, but yeah.
It's frustrating to me. In the United States, we have a lot of people now who are extremely wealthy. I think we have over 700 billionaires in the United States. And yet, when I walk around the Bay Area, in Berkeley, I'm stepping over people who are living on the sidewalk.
Yeah.
I didn't grow up in a country like that. It's become much more unequal in my lifetime. The United States is considered to be the greatest democracy on the planet. I think in some ways it might be the oldest, but it's not the greatest. We're ranked 26 on the democracy index, and Brazil is listed number 49. So we both, as nations, have a lot to improve upon. Where do we start?
Yeah, that's a good point, John. The empirical evidence shows that, inequality. Of course, you can address inequality as one of the main agendas of any government, and this should be, especially in countries like ours, should be a priority in a way. It's always very difficult. The empirical evidence shows that you need a catastrophe to reach a greater leveling, because you reach both rich and poor. And the US maybe a bit more, but in Brazil we just had a kind of mild leveling. in some periods in the 40s, and the idea is that when you go too fast, too radical, or not radical, but a bit more, a bit stronger in your policies towards equality, in the end, you just have a kind of backlash, and the political system is very reactive, and maybe what you get of equality, you get maybe 10 years of dictatorship. And this is very difficult. So the math here is really complicated. I guess what Brazil has done. So, for example, if we look at Lula's government, the first two terms, so from 2003 to 2006 and 2007 to 2010, so almost for 80 years overall. And also a bit of Dilma Rousseff government. What happened is that we saw an increase in welfare, so well-being. So people just got better off. And the rich became richer, the poor became less poor. So this is what happened. The inequality remained stable, but the people felt that their life was getting better. And this matters. So, of course, we need to address inequality in a way. For example, the tax system in Brazil is totally, I can say, it affects much more the poorest than the richest. So this is how it is. So you have much more, you don't have income taxes that big. You have more goods and services, and in the end, it's just like also this real estate is not very much taxed here in Brazil. So in the end, it's just like you keep the poor under this crazy taxation system here in Brazil, and you keep the rich. Okay, we are not okay. Somehow we affected, but not that much. And this is the reality. Brazil has never really changed that much. If you inherit, for example, a house here in Brazil, you're going to pay 4% of taxes, which is, in comparison to other countries, is very low. But if you buy a MacBook Pro, you're going to pay maybe 3 times what you pay, or not maybe 3 times, but 2 times and a half more than you pay in the US. So this is interesting. So you see that, of course, a MacBook is not something that usually people buy. But if you buy rice in the supermarket, you're going to pay much more than normally. So in the end, it's very unequal. So maybe you can begin by change the tax system in a way. This is, for example, what the Lula's agenda, the first reform he wants to address here in Congress is a tax reform, because, that's it. It go very step by step, incremental, whenever. I can say, for example, every regime crisis we had in Brazil, for example, when you had this small period of democracy, and inequality is somehow attacked by the government, trying to make the country more equal. What happened next is actually a regime being pressed, and we have a power takeover by a dictator. Or maybe not a dictator as usually, but like Bolsonaro, a far-right autocrat who actually wanted to be an autocrat, but he was not re-elected. Yeah.
You wrote that in your article, The Brazilian Constitution of 1988 and Its Ancient Ghosts. You say every time there is a political turmoil and a disturbance to the rule of law in the country, the support for democracy seems to dwindle. And this is what concerns me a lot too in the United States. I feel like, after what we experienced with President Trump, there was a constant battering of our democratic principles. It was like he was saying to people, hey, this democracy isn't working for you, just forget about it. Just put me in charge and I'll take care of things. And people here bought it.
I think it's not something that these would-be autocrats are really interested in. I think it's just a strategy, a communication strategy. Yeah. Here in Brazil, I think in a more chaotic situation than in the West, Bolsonaro was really, for example, you had someone like the Secretary of Culture, the cabinet who's going to be responsible for the culture. He didn't like culture at all. You had someone, was totally weird. We had someone responsible for, like discriminatory agency, just like to protect, the equality of, the blacks and and the guy was totally, we don't have racism in our history. We don't need this. All of this, so it's actually, you have someone at the environment, so like the environment ministry, and he said, Amazon is just, we need the economy there. We don't need the Amazon forest or something. Let's just, put the miners there. Let's just, what is the point of having Indians? They have a lot of territory. They have these lands, big lands. So we need to make them, this is, and so all the policies were actually the opposite of what they should be. And the idea was actually destruction, destroy whatever we had, because and they dismantled all these agencies responsible for environment, culture, education. For example, the university could somehow handle, because we have, historically, the best universities are the public universities, and we are all public servants. So we have some protection, and he could not reach that point, but he almost did that. So we didn't have much money for, research and anything. So it's just like we were actually canceled as professors. And so in the end, it was just like science, culture, environment, all these areas were totally dismantled. That's reality. The good thing is that it's over, at least for now.
So your Constitution was written in 1988, and as I understand it, it was written by a constituent assembly created from the members of various political parties. Is it your first democratic constitution?
No, we had one in 1946, which was, we can say, was a democratic one, because from 1930 to 1945, we had a dictatorship, Vargas, we call Estado Novo. And when he left office, we had this 1946 constitution, which was, we can say, was a democratic one, but a very turbulent democratic period. And so in the end, this kind of paved the way for the dictatorship in 1964. So the Constitution lasted just a few years, from 1946 to 1964. But it was a democratic one. And then 1998 is actually our current Constitution, yeah.
What are the real strengths, the democratic strengths of the political system in Brazil? I know you have a multi-party system, for example. Is that something you consider to be very democratic?
When Brazil transitioned to democracy, many scholars, especially from the US, were very skeptical about the possibility that our political system would be stable. They saw various deadlocks that would take place in our political system, many veto players. So in the end, the system would be too chaotic. And also many thought that this military legacy that was not really handled. So when the transition took place, the military still kept many, some clause there in the Constitution giving them some benefit. So they saw this transition was very controlled. Bargains were not that democratic in the end, so the situation would be not that well. But over the years, I saw this perspectives, even from the same scholars, they saw that the system was better than they first thought. And we had presidents running from the center right, center left, center right, center left. It was a kind of a normal system. Of course, we had a polarization, we had this typical political conflicts, but comparing to what we had in the past was quite good.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody was actually seeing the revival of the military. No, nobody was seeing the possibility of coming like a far right president. It was not actually. It's crazy what happened in the last years. So we had some strengths in our constitutions, I can say, because we could manage for over 30 years a quite stable system. If you see, for example, the presidential agenda, Congress could actually pass most of the legislation that presidents brought to Congress. So the political discipline, the coalitions, they were strong. So, for example, Lula, the first government of Lula was a study by Monge, which is, they both argued that Lula, for example, had 86% of approval of this the legislation that was sent to Congress. So in the end, it was quite functional. The political system worked quite okay. Of course, the trade-offs maybe were not that legit, or there were sometimes we can say this is the problem of some presidential systems. Sometimes the things are not that transparent, but in the end, it was quite okay.
Lula was, I think he left office under arrest. How did that end?
No, he was not in office when he was arrested. So this case is really important to mention because, of course, sometimes the listeners that are not from Brazil might have a different perspective, different views of what happened here. I can say that what had happened was Lula was not in office anymore. It was during Temer's presidency, which was... and he stayed in prison 580 days, so more than 1 year. And the process was all, and now reading and coming, and actually at the time we were already aware of what was happening, but the press and many other, and many journalists and also some lawyers and also some judges, they had a perception that they were not aware what was really going on. And actually, this is a very typical case of lawfare, I can say. For sure, it's impressive. Judge Moro, who was the judge presiding over the case, kind of negotiated all the decisions and the different phases of this process with the prosecutors, which is totally, and then the Supreme Court ruled that the Judge Moro actually with partiality, which is a very serious thing. So, and all the cases that were related to Lula were, of course, void.
Dismissed.
Yeah, dismissed, yeah.
I don't understand this idea that somehow his administration was corrupt, huh? Corruption in Brazil is a problem.
Yeah, it is. It is a problem. The corruption, but it's actually not something of his government itself. This has been Brazil's presidentialism over the years.
Okay.
So what happens is that's the problem. If you look at how this, pork barreling or in Congress, also trade-offs in Congress, sometimes they are not that transparent. And of course, also you had these private mechanisms of funding for elections. And this is where corruption, goes fast and goes strong. And this is what happened. So, and during Dilma's government, which was the one who succeeded Lula, we had this Petrobras scandal, which was also another way that people say actually found to maybe fund this mechanism of elections, the political system. So the political system has real problems because it has this corruption schemes, but this has been Brazil's history. But the fact is, on the other hand, that the mechanisms of accountability, checks, and transparency became much stronger over the years. And the reason is that maybe this took place during Lula's, Dilma's, Rousseff's government is actually this institutions, agencies responsible for transparency and accountability. They were actually fighting things they were not fighting before. And this is, So if you go to Fernando Henrique, if you go to, the former presidents, Collor, you see also things happening, corruption in a way.
You would think it'd be more or less easy to control, but in the United States, I think the latest presidential election costs something like $1 billion to hold an election. And then you see our representatives are constantly raising money for their campaigns. I'm thinking to myself, what is that all about? Because an election shouldn't take really much money at all to hold an election. Americans own the airwaves in the United States. It's their they belong to the American people. And you would think a candidate running for office could get on the television for free and discuss what he believes and what he wants to do. Even if that was so important to me, the politician should be someone who is representing your interests, right? So in America, politicians are kind of picking their voters. It's the other way around. It's just like they're the ones who are deciding who's going to vote for them. The gerrymandering, the way that money influences who gets nominated in the primary process. All these things disenfranchise Americans in terms of who they get to vote for to begin with. So their choices are fairly narrow by the time we get down to an actual election. 20 political parties, they're not all as influential. Some are much more influential than others, and probably only a few dominate the political discourse in Brazil. Is that correct?
Yes, I think the political system, when you compare to the US, is quite different. Brazil has this multi-party, fragmented system, maybe 20 parties, now a bit less in Congress because there was a reform in 2017, which raised the threshold for parties to get elected. But yes, you in the US have a really serious problem, especially because your system, you have this districts, you have counties, you have this gerrymandering, which is very problematic because it's more flexible, perhaps. If you say we have a district here in Brazil, it's actually the state, so it's actually, we don't have our system of representation is very different from the US. Mm-hmm. It's not that it's better, but it might be more rigid to change. So gerrymandering, it's not actually a discussion we have. What we have is we call malapportionment. We can say it's just like you have some states which are much more populous and they are less represented than states which are there are just 1,000 of people living there instead of a lot of millions. But this is our problem. But one thing that might be different from the US, and this actually related to corruption, this was a consequence of this debate over corruption in Brazil, is that the Supreme Court ruled that private funding for political campaigns is forbidden. Oh. So you cannot get money from private companies, or if you do, there's a lot of, requirements, actually from private persons. You can, but you need to, a lot of bureaucracy. It's not that simple. So what you have public funding. So the state pays for the campaigns, which is not that good because in the end we pay a lot of money. The campaigns in Brazil are one of the most expensive in the world. So we have a lot of and it's just getting more expensive over the years. So if you see how it has grown in the last elections, it's quite impressive.
The elections in Brazil are publicly funded. And they're getting more and more expensive.
Yeah, they're getting more expensive. So people are paying a lot of money for that. So it should be very, it should not cost that much, but it costs a lot. But the side effect of this is interesting because, private companies, regular private companies cannot pay for campaigns, but churches can. Because they are not actually companies or for-profit companies. So in the end, this is a kind of workaround that it might, and this is also explains a bit the rise of the far right and the right in Brazil.
We have a separation of church and state. Churches are not allowed to make donations to public elections.
Yeah, this is something that when the Supreme Court decided this case, some scholars kind of, the decision sounds good because as a Republican thing, it's best that we don't have private companies kind of rigging the system in a way, because of course, if you have like someone getting more money, he's going to be elected more easily. This is obvious. On the other hand, you have the parties. So you have this, the bigwigs in every party who gets more money, and they distribute this money according to their interest. It's not very transparent how this distribution takes place. And in the end, I don't know if it's best or not, but it's better not than private money. But the private money is actually what caused many of these corruption scandals in Brazil.
This is something that human beings just haven't figured out how to do. I mean, it seems to me that there are countries that don't have this problem. Norway, I don't know. Does Norway have this kind of problem? I don't think so. I mean, it's a small country, but still, it seems like we ought to have a solution to this problem. We should know by now how to fix this. Don't we know how to do it?
Yeah, this is important because usually we neglect a bit this debate over representation, especially in law schools, in constitutional law. We focus much more in Supreme Court, justice system, how it's gonna be, that decision of the Supreme Court, how it's gonna affect this, how it's gonna affect society, and we forget exactly this representation. It's the political side of the problem. Many political sides, of course, they have many discussions of representation, and it's something really, really fascinating.
Yeah,
I just think that it's a matter of constitutional design. How can we make a better design for political players to represent society in a way? I think Brazil has a lot of problems. Sometimes we say, and people are always trying to change in a way. For example, Brazil has been presidential. Brazil was a monarchy for some time,
right?
But then after it became a republic, it became a presidential country since then. But we have never really dealt well with the idea of being presidential because we always try to become parliamentarian country and sometimes semi-presidential. We have had this debate many opportunities in our history because we always discuss this idea of representation, whether we are doing this well or not. And I think one thing that adds more complexity to this debate is because we are a federation, and federation, of course, makes things a bit more complex.
Yeah.
So it's a rich debate, fascinating debate.
In the last episode, we had talked with Harvey J.K. and Alan Minsky from Progressive Democrats of America, and they're proposing a new economic Bill of Rights for America along the lines of what FDR proposed in 1944. And when I hear that inequality in Brazil is such a problem, I'm wondering if this would be an approach that you might want to use in Brazil as well. Is it a matter of economic rights in Brazil? How does Brazil solve this problem of inequality?
John, this matters. This is a wonderful question because if you look at Brazil, our constitution has a lot of social rights. So in a way, we have somehow a Bill of Rights, social rights in our constitutions already, like many other countries in the world. It's not something exclusive in Brazil. Many constitutions, especially the most recent constitutions, feature social rights in their text. So I don't know if we have more social rights in the constitutions, we'll make things much better. They will, in a way.
Yeah.
I think it matters. I'm not saying that the fact that we have or not have not planned the idea of having social rights, the Constitution at the beginning, doesn't play a role. Of course, it does, but I think I just doesn't feel the idea that having more rights in the Constitution means that we're going to enforce more rights to the reality. Even though, for example, in the case of Brazil, it's obvious that the facts that we have, for example, workers' rights, so you have labor rights, you have pension rights, we have social security rights there in the Constitution, education rights, healthy rights in our Constitution. It plays a role. We see, for example, cases at the Supreme Court being decided in a more positive way because we have these rights in our Constitution. So it matters. I just don't think that it matters that much. I don't think the landscape in the U.S. Will change radically because you're going to have rights, maybe a Bill of Rights in your Constitution. You see, for example, one discussion that it's quite important. For example, you have the Civil Rights Act. It took a while until you still have this situation very strongly, discrimination in the U.S., even though you have an interest in the Civil Rights Act in the U.S. The idea of gender inequality that you planned maybe to have a constitutional amendment and you didn't actually went much further. The question is, if you had this in your constitution written there, how much your reality will change? I don't know.
Wow.
But it matters. At least symbolic, you know.
Matt Vortrup in season 1 pointed out that the Hungarian constitution looks really good on paper.
Yeah.
But Orban it's kind of gone the other way, right? It's become more of an autocratic nation.
Yeah.
He's amassed a lot of power somehow. I can't pretend to understand what happened in Hungary, but I do understand that it is a fairly democratic constitution in principle, but the actors are really not democratic. So it comes down to the people who are in the political system and what they want to do with it, I suppose.
I think sometimes it's even better. It's better to have like devices, tools in the Constitution, or institutions in the constitutions that maybe play a role in really having all the Bill of Rights written. I think you need more the process or design process of how it is going to be enforced rather than just, okay, we need to, housing rights. This is maybe if you write in the Constitution that maybe they're going to have an institution and there's this process and there's like this mechanisms that you have to protect this right. This might matter more. This might have a greater impact than really just the right. And what you see in many constitutions which have this, this set of rights, many rights there, they have a lot of rights, but they don't have the mechanisms to protect them or to enforce them. So they don't have the processes. They have not even the institutions. Yeah. They just have the rights, and you need the mechanism, the system to work. So the engine of the Constitution is actually it keeps this extractive mechanisms of it's not actually including people. But it gives the idea that it's including people because it has a lot of Bill of Rights, but it doesn't has there written those mechanisms how to enforce them. It's kind of I can say a malicious strategy, because you have these rights there, but you don't have the mechanisms to enforce them. So the engine of the Constitution is kept intact while you have those, that set of rights that is quite impressive for the world.
Yeah.
And for example, you mentioned Hungary. Hungary is just one example. Of course, Hungary is passing through a very difficult moment, in my opinion, because they have this autocracy, actually. Orban is doing whatever. It's not working that well for democracy there. It's not actually a democracy any longer, I guess. So, but if even democracies, many democracies actually, there's actually a kind of opposite, I can say, correlation. If you see the countries where you have more rights being forced are usually countries where you see less rights in the constitution. So, yeah, so...
That was a debate that they had early on in our constitutional convention in 1787. They talked about why should we put rights in the Constitution? Maybe, that could create more problems.
Yeah.
So they're interesting.
Yeah, it is. This history. But one thing that maybe was important in the U.S. I'm not an expert in U.S. American constitutionalist, but but anyway. But one thing that might be important because when you had the Bill of Rights in 1791, I guess.
Yeah.
You had this large set of freedoms there. This somehow helped to diminish the risk of factions. This is something that Madison was quite aware of and concerned about. So even though he might not be that, favorable in the beginning for having this Bill of Rights as one pillars of the American constitutionalism, in the end might have been good in a way because for the idea of this, what he called this faction, risk of faction. Right? But you don't have social rights. Social rights is not actually the point in the American Constitution. Unlike here in Brazil, social rights is actually there. You see, for example, just one comparison. If you see decisions by our Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court, you have the right to health, medicine, even if you have expensive medicine, it's your right. And this is something wrong compared to other countries. And this is here.
I have a friend who says any political or economic system will be just fine as long as the people who are operating it are really great people. Some truth to that, I think. But then the argument has always been that we can't depend on, good people being elected all the time. And so we have to have ways of making sure that the right thing gets done in other ways. We have to have institutions that will promote the public good and the public interest. As I said in our last podcast, we talked about an economic Bill of Rights. And there's this idea in America that, all men are created equal, all men and women, I will say. I've recently begun to think that there's really very little truth to that everybody's born into such different circumstances and their opportunities are very different in general. And maybe Thomas Paine believed that democracies have to be based on equality and justice. But I see those as almost unobtainable goals. I mean, how do you create a society of equals? How do we end the inequality that is leading to more corruption, leading to greater division amongst the members of society? I mean, equality is an important element of any stable society, I think, but it seems very elusive, very difficult to achieve. And Brazil is a good example, right? You said a lot of inequality in Brazil.
Yeah, very unequal.
How are we going to change these things? I mean, Brazil and the United States are two of the largest democracies in the world. How are we going to deal with this problem? Is it simply through elections, or are there constitutional changes that we need in both countries that will help?
I think I think, of course, I always have the opinion that it matters. For example, the constitution design matters. So if we have better design, it affects reality. But it's just one thing. It's not actually culture matters. Other things that are of constitutional identities, constitutional cultures. All this matter, but I guess we need to be maybe aware that the idea of equality as something that we can reach in a more radical way. I don't see this happening really.
Canada has about 38 million people, and it is ranked 12th on the Global Democracy Index. 38 million people. The United States has 330 million people, and we're ranked 26th. And Brazil has about 220 million people and ranks 49th, respectively. Those are the three largest democracies in the Western Hemisphere. Why should the U.S. and Brazil, the two most populous democracies in the Western Hemisphere, not deal with inequality? And, I love the fact that you're really focused on this issue. Is inequality the metric by which we should measure the effectiveness of our democracies?
Yeah, I have this thesis, I think, not a thesis, but actually an argument, I guess.
Yeah.
If you don't have equality, all the institutions don't function that well. So even the Constitution, I always think Constitutions are like a coordination device. So all institutions are, in a way, also coordination device. When you don't have equality, the way we coordinate behaviors, either institutional behaviors or individual behaviors, they'll be problematic in a way. Yeah. So this is how democracy fails in the end. I think the US and Brazil are good examples of why, even though they are democracies, they are flawed in a way. It's just very unequal. And I don't think they're going to be much more equal in the near future. They might get better. Well-being might increase, but not equality that much, unfortunately. Yeah.
Inequality and democracy. How do you associate the two ideas? Are they inextricably related, or are they completely separate ticket items? Do Americans even believe in equality anymore? What does equality mean to you? Tune in next time when I talk with Francis Chu from the School of Public Engagement in New York City about equality and democracy as written about by none other than Thomas Paine, the man who started it all, in his book, Rights of Man.